Bill, there are two reviews of your book on the historical Adam that we've been affectionately, or maybe not so affectionately, calling the Dueling reviews, and they're on the Modern Reformation blog. Here's the introduction to that blog. In his most recent monograph, William Lane Craig takes up one of the most pressing issues in contemporary apologetics, the question of the origins of humanity and the historicity of the Genesis account of Adam and Eve. Because of Dr. Craig's eminent reputation and the topic of this book, we wish to provide two different perspectives on it. And so we invited both Dr. Hojan An and Dr. Chad McIntosh to review Dr. Craig's book. Well, Bill, this review from Chad McIntosh is a little more positive. He titled his article, "Bad Time for a Good Book." Let's find out why he thinks that. He writes, William Lane Craig embarks on a quest to answer two main questions. First, does the Bible present them as real historical persons or mere literary figures used by biblical authors to illustrate theological truths? Second, if they are real, Adam and Eve, historical persons, then is belief in this original pair as the font of humanity in conflict with current science of human origins? Were the genre of Genesis straightforward historical narrative, the answer to the first question would be settled. But matters aren't so easy. According to Craig, Genesis 1 through 11 exhibits nearly all of the hallmarks of the genre of myth. But we must be careful here. As literary scholars use the term, a myth is not a popular idea or falsehood, but a traditional sacred narrative believed by members of a society that explains present realities by anchoring them in the prehistoric past. Yet at the same time, historical interest is not absent from the author of Genesis, as the genealogies show. Thus, Craig thinks that Thorkild Jacobson's genre of mytho-history, a genre where real historical events are narrated but with non-literal literary devices used to communicate theological truths, is therefore an apt classification of Genesis. Popular aversions to the word myth notwithstanding, I think that's a good, and that's the end of the quote there, Bill. I think that's a pretty good thumbnail of the book.
Yes, isn't it wonderful how a philosopher like Chad McIntosh can so succinctly and accurately summarize the contents of a book and present the argument. It's such a contrast to the review by An, who is a theologian.
Continuing the article, he writes, of the dozen or so relevant New Testament texts, Craig finds only a handful in Paul's letters that plausibly assert a historical Adam. The rest, he argues, require the pair to be no more than literary figures that illustrate theological truths. For instance, when Jesus refers to the monogamous unions of Adam and Eve, he does so to discern its implication for marriage and divorce, not asserting its historicity. End of quote there. He quoted you. By contrast, Paul's theology requires a historical Adam and Eve, for Paul identifies Adam as responsible for a real-world event, the fall, that led in time to other real-world effects, most importantly, Christ's atonement. For Craig, this suffices for the affirmation of a historical Adam. End of quote there. Bill, as far as most people are concerned, we can sing a song and take up an offering and go home after that part. They just want to hear some sort of affirmation of Adam and Eve.
Yes, and that's exactly what I give on the basis of the genealogies, and then Paul's ascribing real world effects to Adam's sin shows that the Bible is committed to the historicity of Adam and Eve as real historical persons.
Continuing, next, Chad writes, having completed the first leg of his quest, Craig sets out on the second, that is, to determine whether belief in an original pair as the font of humanity is in conflict with current science of human origins. The main objections to this, considered in the book's penultimate chapter, turn out to be surprisingly weak, so long as the primordial pair are located far enough in the distant past to account for the genetic and geographic diversity that we see in the human population around the world today. This is exactly what the evidence already surveyed in the third part of the book indicates. Paleoneurological and archaeological evidence concerning when the first humans emerge places them within the Pleistocene epoch, commonly known as the Ice Age, from 2.5 million to 12,000 years ago. To establish this, of course, one must first determine what counts as human. End of quote there. We'll delve into that next, Bill, but you may want to remind listeners what paleoneurology is.
Paleoneurology is the study of the brains of ancient hominins like Neanderthals, Homo erectus, Homo rhodesiensis, and so forth, primarily based upon the evidence of skulls and what are called endocasts. They take a mold or a cast of the interior of the skull to help determine the brain size and configuration, and you can derive some idea of the cognitive capacities of such an individual. And we want to, I think, say that any hominin that had an insufficient brain capacity to maintain modern cognitive behaviors could not have been human.
Next, he writes, Craig cautions against simplistically equating the natural kind of human with organisms scientifically classified as Homo. There's a wide variety of organisms within Homo that are plausibly not human and others that are plausibly human but not Homo sapien. To be human in the relevant sense is to exhibit sufficient anatomical and cognitive similarity with modern humans. One of the more interesting and dramatic aspects of Craig's study is how multiple lines of evidence across several disciplines slowly converge, pointing to the common ancestor of Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens as the earliest species with the anatomical features and cognitive capacity to count as fully human. This was Homo heidelbergensis, whose image the book's dust jacket bears. Craig therefore identifies Adam and Eve as members of this group, having lived between 750,000 and 1 million years ago. End of quote there. That's the second caution mentioned, Bill, not only how we define mytho-historical, but how we define human.
Yes, this is a critical issue because, as Chad notes, not every species that is classified as Homo was genuinely human. When geologists or paleontologists developed these classifications, they only had basically two, either Australopithecines or Homo. And they just lumped almost indiscriminately different hominins into these two categories without a great deal of discrimination. And so there are a good number of these early Homo hominin forms that I think are plausibly not human, like early Homo erectus or Homo naledi. They had a brain capacity that is not much more than a modern ape, and therefore would not be justifiably called human. So what we need to look for would be hominins that exhibited cognitive behavior comparable to modern cognitive capacity, things like planning for the future, technological innovation, symbolic thinking, and representative thinking. And it is striking how, through the examination of archaeology, you can find what are called archaeological signatures of that modern cognitive capacity going back literally hundreds of thousands of years. And I'm so glad that Chad draws attention to this in the book, because I think one of the most fascinating aspects of the books is the review it offers of these incredible archaeological signatures that suggest that modern cognitive behaviors go back beyond Homo sapiens to Neanderthals, and even beyond that to Homo heidelbergensis, or Heidelberg man, the last common ancestor of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens.
Up next, Bill, I think he seems to wish you had written more on what it means to be made in the image of God. He writes, quoting, "In particular, what it means for man to be made in the image of God is left unclear, which is a surprising lacuna given the book's topic. To be made in the image of God," Craig argues, "is to have certain faculties like rationality, self-consciousness, freedom of the will, and so forth. That is, to be persons in the same way that God is personal and thus have the attributes of personhood. It is precisely the properties of personhood that are manifested by the cognitive behaviors to which we have appeals as evidence of humanity." Quoting you there, "This can't be quite right," he says, "since angels and demons are persons in this sense, but are not human and not created in God's image, or at least not explicitly stated in the Bible to be so. There must be something else about bearing God's image that makes one human. But what?" And then quoting you, he says, "The stubborn fact is that Genesis leaves the image and likeness of God undefined." End of quote. He continues, "That may be so, but can't we as Christian philosophers say more?" Bill?
I think there's some confusion here on Chad's part. I think my characterization of the image of God as having faculties like rationality, self-consciousness, freedom of the will, and so forth is quite adequate to understand what it means to be made in God's image. It would have the implication that, yes, angels and demons are also created in the image of God, and I see nothing objectionable about that biblically. In fact, in Genesis 1:26 and 27, when God creates man in his image and likeness, it's so interesting that he uses the plural. Let us make man in our image and likeness. And many Old Testament commentators think that this is a reference to the angelic court to whom God speaks. In that case, angels and fallen angels are also like us, created in the image of God. The reason they're not human is because they don't have a hominin body as we do. We are persons just as they are persons, but we are human persons in virtue of having a hominin body as well as a rational soul.
Here's the conclusion, Bill, quoting, "Finally, I can't help but wonder about the book's reception and impact. The chapters on the genre of Genesis are a tour de force, and they would be an invaluable contribution to popular debates about the meaning and interpretation of Genesis. But will they be? I have my doubts. Despite being described as a popular level book, Craig's quest may be too challenging for the average layperson. So, are we to despair at the prospect of a responsible position ever becoming mainstream among evangelicals? Craig just does not appreciate how steep of a mountain the word myth will create for evangelical Christians. It is, in my estimation, insurmountable. That word and the book's cover will almost certainly alienate a large and important audience who wrestle with reconciling their faith with the claims of popular scientific accounts of human origins. That said, as all Christians know, a precious gift can be refused for foolish reasons." End of quote. Before you wrap it up for us, Bill, I want to say I was very moved by that last sentence. Yeah. A precious gift can be refused for foolish reasons.
Yeah. I have often asked myself, Kevin, what will be the long-range impact of this book, even after I have shuffled off this mortal coil and am no longer on the scene? And I don't know what to predict, but I do sense that the evangelical community is changing, that they do exhibit a remarkable openness to understandings of Genesis that are not based upon a wooden literalism such as young earth creationists espouse. I think that point of view and that interpretation is a rapidly shrinking minority, at least in the West. And therefore, I I'm hopeful for the impact of the book. I used the word myth uh, self-consciously and deliberately because I wanted to be straight up with my reader, to not use euphemisms or mince words, but to explain how the word is used by students of folklore, by classicists, and then to use the word in that sense. The irony is, Kevin, that many other evangelical New Testament commentators are already saying the same thing, but they're using different, less emotionally loaded words. For example, Gordon Wenham refers to Genesis 1 to 11 as proto history. John Collins calls it worldview history. John Walton calls it imagistic history. All of these are really talking about the same thing that Torkild Jacobsen called mythohistory, but they don't want to use the word myth because, as Chad McIntosh notes, in popular culture, this is loaded with the connotations of falsehood and unreliability. And so it's important that we understand how the word is being used in the literary sense of the classicist.